In this week's video, I'm going to cover the biggest mistakes you can do when using a telephoto lens for landscape photography. The telephoto lens is an underappreciated lens for landscape photography. When I started out as a landscape photographer, it was known that a wide-angle lens is the landscape lens. But hopefully over the years I have debunked that, at least through my channel here. A telephoto lens is indeed as much a landscape lens as a wide angle and a standard zoom lens is. And some of my absolute favorite photos I have ever taken of landscapes has been with the long lens. And just to have the definition set, when I talk about a telephoto lens, I'll be showing photos that have been taken with a focal length longer than 70mm. So I'll be covering lenses like a 70 to 200mm, 100 to 400mm, and all other telephoto lenses in that ballpark, including drone photos taken with either the short or long telephoto lens. I will also show photos from super zoom lenses like the Tamron 28 to 200mm, but only if they've been photographed beyond the focal length of 70mm. But let's jump into some of the biggest mistakes you can do with your telephoto lens. And the first and probably one of the biggest mistakes you can do is to have an unbalanced setup. When photographing with a long lens, even the strongest ball head can slide a bit if the lens is too heavy, resulting in blurry photos. And it's even worse if your lens extends its barrel. You absolutely do want to make sure to use the lens collar with the lens foot if it comes with one. If your telephoto lens does not come with a lens collar, it ought to be the first accessory you buy to your telephoto lens. Along with a proper lens foot, one that's Arca Swiss capable, and not that weird stuff that Sony ships their telephoto lenses with. The specific lens foot I use for my 100 to 400mm is from Kirk, and the one I use for my 50 to 400mm from Tamron is the official Tamron lens collar. You have to buy that separately, which is a bit of a downer, but at least it is Arca Swiss capable. And speaking of the lens collar, the next mistake you can do is to flip the entire setup when doing vertical photos. It makes your entire setup more unstable. It's also much more cumbersome and just flat out annoying. What you want to do is to unlock the little button on the lens collar and flip the camera and lens within the lens collar. In that way, you simply just keep more or less the same composition, and it's of course much easier. And you just tighten it back whenever you're done using it. The risk of getting blurry photos due to lens shake increases dramatically the more you zoom in. Traditionally, the rule of thumb to get sharp photos and avoid blurry photos due to shaking is to use the double shutter speed of your focal length. This means if you're photographing at 200mm, then you do not want to have a slower shutter speed than 1/400th of a second. However, with modern image stabilization in both the camera and the lens, it's much easier to get tag-sharp photos with slower shutter speeds. This makes you much less dependent on using a tripod for holding your camera still, which in turn means much less hassle for most photographers. And with the added bonus of you being able to work faster. So help yourself by not using too much tripod when you're out photographing with a telephoto lens. The lens hood is designed for avoiding flaring, and it's sublime during snow and rain to avoid getting droplets or snowflakes on the front element of your lens. Getting anything on the lens can reduce image quality and manifest in spots or even darker patches in your photos. The lens hood is generally also good from protecting your lens from scratches or whatever you will bump it into. However, a big downside to the lens hood is when you photograph in windy conditions and want a stable setup. The lens hood can almost work as a parachute, capturing more wind and making your setup shake even more than if it wasn't attached. This is something you need to be aware of, and whether it makes sense to have the lens hood attached or not is something you will have to take on a case-by-case basis. A telephoto lens is of course amazing for zooming in and capturing those far away photos like distant mountain peaks, and when the light just hits those mountain peaks, it's just extra magical. But you usually end up with whatever you're photographing and then the sky as a background. And these types of photos can also easily lack a sense of depth and can potentially turn out a bit boring. If you want to introduce a feeling of 3D when using a telephoto lens, it's super important to think in layers, layers, layers. This will require you to move your feet more than if you use a wide-angle lens, because the parallax effect when using the long lens over greater distances is much smaller. Basically, if you shoot with a wide-angle lens and introduce the immediate foreground, then you don't have to move more than a few centimeters to completely change the foreground. But when using a telephoto lens and your foreground is much further away, then you really have to work for it to build up your scene. Like in this example from Glencoe in Scotland, where this photo in itself is really beautiful. You do see the depth because of all the layers down throughout the valley, but if you want to bring in more of a foreground, I may have to do a bit of walking. Or in this example from the Faroe Islands, where we hiked up to the ridge, and then I had to hike further up the hill to get to the vantage point where I could use the ridge with Thomas as a foreground. So if you want to create more drama and a sense of 3D in your telephoto lens photos, make sure to include more layers in the landscape. I do cover much more about depth and other compositional tools in my ebooks on compositional landscape photography. I recently gave them a massive update with more pages and now also including extended EXIF data to all the photos, streamlining them with my ebook all about light and landscape photography. So if you've held back on getting them for this reason, now is your chance. With tons of examples and minimal text, all the ebooks are super easy to read, and I make sure to get to the point fast. There is a link to my ebooks down in the description of the video. When photographing a big vista scene from beyond 300mm and especially 400 and 500mm, you need to be careful of atmospheric disturbances. When using a powerful telephoto lens for landscapes, you aren't just compressing the perspective, you are also shooting through a massive amount of air. This is where physics start to mess with your image and you can experience disturbances such as heat shimmer, heat haze, and atmospheric turbulence, resulting in optical turbulence, which is a visual wavy effect causing blur in your photos. As this happens because warm and cold air mixes, there's nothing you can do as a photographer to combat this besides just avoiding it. Well, at least if you don't want to have it part of your photograph. To minimize heat haze, prioritize shooting at sunrise when the ground is cool and air layers are most stable, as afternoon heat creates significant distortion. You can also improve the clarity of your scene by shooting from a higher elevation to avoid the turbulent air near the surface, or by choosing an overcast day and post-rain conditions when the atmosphere is naturally clearer. Finally, shooting during a light breeze can help break up large heat waves, though timing remains the most critical factor for sharp telephoto landscapes. So another reason to get up early and appreciate another sunrise shoot. And the next mistake is all about how to deal with image stabilization when shooting on a tripod. One of the biggest mistakes you could do photographing with a telephoto lens used to be keeping the image stabilization on when photographing from a tripod. This has though changed a little bit over the past years. If you're using an older system like a DSLR, not a mirrorless, it's still beneficial to turn off the image stabilization because it's a mechanical system that tries to compensate for shakes that ought to not be there when you use a tripod. And that compensation can actually create some micro vibrations. However, with the introduction of mirrorless cameras and better image stabilization systems, it has changed a bit over the years and it's hard to point to a best practice. My general suggestion is to try both in several different circumstances with several different shutter speeds and see what works for your system. Turning it off, you definitely avoid any micro shakes made by the IS system. However, your system may be good enough to detect it doesn't need to compensate for any shaking and simply doesn't turn on. However, if you're photographing in windy conditions from a tripod, it can still make great sense to turn on image stabilization, because that will compensate for the micro vibrations of the wind hitting your camera setup. So mistake number 8, when photographing in big vistas, it's generally the rule of thumb to have everything in focus from front to back. But when you increase your focal length, as you do with telephoto lenses, you also decrease your depth of field, which force you to decrease or close down your aperture to compensate and again increase your depth of field. Now, if you only have one layer of landscape in your scene, you can just focus on that and call it a day. However, in an example like this from the Faroe Islands, I can't get both the foreground and background in focus at once. If I focus on the foreground, the background will be out of focus, and if I focus on the background, the foreground will be out of focus. And that's even though the distance between the foreground and the camera is about 250 meters, and the greater the distance between the camera and wherever you focus will also increase the depth of field. You can also see on this depth of field table that I in fact can't get the entire scene in focus, even at f16, because the background is much further away than 975 meters, which is my depth of field far limit, as long as my subject is 250 meters away. The only thing you can really do to get everything in focus in one shot is to stop down the aperture even further with the risk of introducing more diffraction, so that's generally something you want to avoid. Or you can zoom a bit out to widen your depth of field, but then you compromise on your composition. Or you can take a photo first of the foreground that's in focus, and then one of the background that's in focus, and then focus stack the photos, blend them together in post-processing. So when shooting with the telephoto lens, make absolutely certain that you get your entire landscape in focus if that's the goal of your photo. On to mistake number 9. As you can see, a telephoto lens can be relatively large compared to your wide-angle lens and your standard zoom lens. And because of that, it can also be easy to have the lazy mindset and leaving the telephoto lens at home or in the car if you go for a hike. Because, you probably not need it anyway. But that's of course also the biggest sin towards your photography that you can make. Because fact of the matter is, the piece of gear you leave at home is the one you're going to need. However, especially in flatter landscapes like we have here in Denmark, the telephoto lens is fantastic for filling the frame with the scene in front of you. Like if you use a wide-angle lens, you may end up including too much of the sky or some kind of like half-assed foreground that doesn't really add to the scene. Whether with a dedicated telephoto zoom lens or the long end of a super zoom lens, some of my all-time favorite photos were taken at the longer focal lengths. Yes, that means that you sometimes have to switch the lenses more often if you also like using a 24 to 70mm, but in my experience it's always worth switching to the telephoto lens if you see a shot that requires those focal lengths. And if you do find your telephoto lens to be too big and too heavy, just switch to a super zoom lens and use the long end of that instead. Yes, you do probably compromise a bit on the aperture and image quality, but you gain a much more practical lens. Or of course just switch to a much smaller system like Micro Four Thirds, with all the compromises that comes with that. I have just started my spring sale where you can save big on my courses and tutorials. You can right now get 25% off my courses on waterfall photography and local landscape photography and standalone editing tutorials, and you can get entire $100 off my huge post-processing course with 20 plus hours and 30 plus videos of in-depth teaching where you learn all my techniques from the most basic of actually using the programs, over masking, cleaning your photos, focus stacking, dodging and burning, adding and controlling glow and atmosphere, to advanced blending of several exposures with or without using luminosity masking. It really is the best and biggest course on landscape photography post-processing with the most bang for the buck available. You can find the coupon codes and links down in the description of the video, and be sure to check out this video if you want to learn much more about how to use a wide-angle lens. See you next time.